Good evening, everyone, or should I say happy Halloween, depending upon when you first see this video, but I just got out of a Fandango early access screening for Dr. Sleep and wanted to give you my spoiler-free review before it opens next weekend. Dr. Sleep is director Mike Flanagan's adaptation of Stephen King's book from 2013, which was a sequel to his novel The Shining from 1977. Dr. Sleep picks up decades after the original story, with Dan Torrance, now an adult, forming an alliance with a young girl named Abra in order to protect her from Rose the Hat and the True Knot, a group that roams the country feeding on those with special abilities like those possessed by Dan and Abra. In anticipation of the movie, I read this book a few months ago, which was the first time I'd read a relatively new book by Stephen King in many years. I absolutely loved it, and it immediately got me thinking about how creatively the book posed a really interesting challenge for Mike Flanagan. Multiple generations of horror fans love and adore Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of The Shining, a version that Stephen King is less than fond of due to the many changes made by Kubrick to the source material, specifically the final fates of Dick Halloran, Jack Torrance, and the Overlook Hotel. I last read The Shining 29 years ago, but I've seen the movie countless times since then, so I'm obviously a little bit biased. But Stephen King was so disappointed in the film that he ended up later writing a miniseries directed by McGarris that would get things right from Stephen King's perspective. The less said about that show, the better, but Mike Flanagan has spoken publicly about his desire to reconcile the differences between Stanley Kubrick's film and Stephen King's books, and make a movie that would function both as a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's movie, as well as be a faithful adaptation of Stephen King's recent novel. After adapting the book Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan sat down with Stephen King to try and solve this creative puzzle and figure out a way to incorporate ingredients from Stanley Kubrick's movie, which Flanagan admits was one of the most exciting aspects of making this recent movie. As everyone has seen in the trailers for Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan got to recreate many iconic scenes from Kubrick's film, although he admitted that the classic shot of a tidal wave of blood pouring forth from the elevator was taken directly from Stanley Kubrick's movie. But no matter where any of us might stand in our preferences between Stephen King's work and Stanley Kubrick's work, the most important question of all is how well does this new movie Dr. Sleep manage to succeed as a self-contained story in its own right. For the last decade, Mike Flanagan has hurled himself into the horror genre, rapidly putting together a really cool filmography, one that I think shows a clear evolution in both his skills as a filmmaker as well as his ambition. I think Oculus and Ouija Origin of Evil are very solid horror movies, but with Gerald's Game and The Haunting of Hill House, you can see that Flanagan's confidence as a director has continued to grow. There's a lot about his latest movie that I thoroughly enjoyed, in particular, Rebecca Ferguson's incredible performance as Rose the Hat. She's one of my favorite new villains that I've seen on the screen in recent memory. They nailed her appearance, and you'd have to be a blind person not to recognize that Ferguson is unimaginably beautiful. But what I loved was how Ferguson completely leaned into the character, clearly having tons of fun with such a diabolical role. I love villains who are completely unrepentant without a shred of guilt, and it wouldn't surprise me at all this time next year if we see a lot of people dressing up as Rose the Hat, both for Comic-Con as well as for Halloween. By far the eeriest scenes of the movie are those where we see the True Knot in action, hunting down fresh victims to feed on their steam. As far as the rest of the cast is concerned, Zan McClarnon is really cool as well as Crow Daddy, Rose the Hat's chief ally in all of her endeavors. Whether you're talking Season 2 of Fargo, or Westworld, or Dr. Sleep, Zan McClarnon, he always brings his A-game. And then we have Kylie Curran, who I'd never seen in a movie before, who also deserves a shout-out as Abra Stone. Anytime you involve child actors in anything, especially a starring role, filmmakers are rolling the dice. But she has tons of charisma, and I think she more than managed to carry her weight, making the character her own, and I think we'll be seeing a lot more of her in the years to come. So I've underlined a lot of the good about this movie, but I do need to talk about some of the flaws as well. Unfortunately, in spite of some fantastic performances, structurally I think this film starts to come unglued a little bit toward the end. I think the narrative problems stem from two factors. First of all, the book Dr. Sleep is over 500 pages long, so naturally some parts of the book will have to go. I think Mike Flanagan did his best to try and streamline the plot, even though the final result remains a pretty long movie at 2 hours and 31 minutes. I'm not sure if the streamlining will even be noticed by folks who haven't read the book, but some viewers out there might have a little trouble keeping up initially, because in the beginning the film's bouncing back and forth between the three storylines involving Dan, Abra, and Rose, setting up the inevitable conflict involving all of them. And if viewers haven't at least seen The Shining, they're going to be totally fucking confused, but that's actually good news. That means they still get to have the unique pleasure of seeing The Shining for the very first time. And when I heard about Mike Flanagan reshooting so much of The Shining for this movie, I was initially a little bewildered as to why he would do so, but having now seen Dr. Sleep, it totally makes sense. Because no matter what, Dr. Sleep is always going to have to recast young Danny, Wendy, and Halloran for the opening scenes from the book Dr. Sleep. And I do think Dr. Sleep works as a movie pretty damn well for the first 2/3 or so, but then the movie starts to come unraveled for a couple of reasons. Without spoiling this detail, I was really caught off guard by the omission of a certain major plot twist, one that most readers will agree gives the True Knot an extra bit of urgency to go ahead and try and capture Abra as quickly as possible. The movie finds a much simpler substitute for why feeding on Abra's steam is so essential. But the biggest problem this movie faces is how much of the ending of the book had to be rewritten in order to reconcile the differences between the endings of Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining and Stephen King's book The Shining, where at the end, the Overlook Hotel exploded. The ending of the book Dr. Sleep takes place where the Overlook used to be, but in this movie, the Overlook is still there, in a very decayed and rotten state, but that fundamentally changes so much about the final confrontation between Dan, Abra, and Rose and how the action unfolds. I'd argue that this movie, Dr. Sleep, actually takes far more liberties than Stanley Kubrick's movie, so it'll be interesting to see if Stephen King protests publicly in any way. My suspicion has always been that Stephen King's dislike of Stanley Kubrick's movie has less to do with the changes Kubrick made and much more to do with a little healthy competition between two very different artists. In any case, I love getting to see Rose the Hat interacting with the Overlook Hotel. For fans of evil characters and evil places, those moments are an absolute joy to watch. But sadly, having so many visual callbacks to Stanley Kubrick's movie ultimately serves to undermine the overall effectiveness of this new movie. Dr. Sleep is a very solid, very enjoyable movie, but it isn't The Shining. Few movies are. It's one of the most beloved horror films ever made, but I do genuinely look forward to the conversations comparing and contrasting all these movies and books. We're in strange new terrain here with a sequel coming out 39 years after the original movie. I mean, if you think about it in terms of the overall history of film going all the way back to 1895, that's basically 1/3 of the entire history of movies as an art form. So my hat's off to Mike Flanagan for taking on this challenge, and I'm eagerly looking forward to seeing this movie again once it's available online, just to see more of Rose the Hat in action. I've kind of got an embarrassing little puppy love crush on her that I don't think I'll be getting over anytime soon. The good news is that for fans of Mike Flanagan, he's coming back at us very soon with Season 2 of The Haunting, which will be based on Turn of the Screw by Henry James. It's a great little read, and we've already had one great movie based on it, The Innocents from the early 60s. I highly recommend that movie, but fingers crossed, Mike Flanagan and his team will knock this show out of the park. So I think that's all I have for now. I hope everyone has some amazing plans to get weird tomorrow evening on Halloween. Halloween is by far my favorite day of the year. And rather than review the new Terminator movie, I plan on getting totally obliterated. And if I'm not too hungover, I'll review Terminator Dark Fate on Friday. But for my costume, I'm going as one of the party goers from Eyes Wide Shut. Obviously, I'm a Kubrick fan. But for my mask, I've got two options. I've got Tom Cruise's mask and I've got Sidney Pollack's mask. Sidney Pollack's mask is way heavier and way more uncomfortable, but I think it looks way cooler. But we'll have to wait and see how much rain there is tomorrow night. I think that'll play a role in which mask I ultimately go with. But if you want to see my costume, follow me on Twitter at Colbrax. I'll definitely be posting some pics before I go out. But if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, give it a share if you feel so inclined. But can't thank you enough for watching it. Hope everyone has an amazing Halloween. Hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.